the second one. Thanks for that. So welcome to the USAF Helm Engage, the second for this year. This platform asks questions and seeks some answers to critical and topical issues in higher education. Today, we're asking questions around internationalization of higher education. This topic came about when the Russia war in the Ukraine triggered us to think about how we here engage with geopolitical issues and the role higher education can play in engaging with cross-border and regional or continental conflicts. We ask questions on how higher education is showing solidarity or supporting students and staff in the war-torn region of northern Mozambique, where almost 100,000 people are displaced by terrorist activities in that region. We ask questions on what our role is in supporting the people suffering the ongoing violence in the Tigray region. What is the role of internationalization in addressing issues of social justice? Can it address it? Should it? And how? How do we include international and intercultural aspects into our local higher education experience? In other words, how do we broaden the international experience of a few to benefit a broader base of students, staff, and institutions? We're in an increasingly connected world where the SDGs offer an ever more important framework for global responsiveness to social justice issues. And how do we engage internationalization to deliver on these social justice goals? So this is about looking east and west and also into the global north, but also and as much, it is about inviting the globe into our local reality and sharing our indigenous knowledge with the world in ways that internationalizes their curricula and their higher education experience. The question is about how we shape our curricula and student experience in such a way that international realities like the conflict in Mozambique and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Tigray region are part of our international experience, international higher education experience. To help us think about these issues, we've asked Professor Hans de Wit, the world's foremost thought leader on internationalization, to share his ideas with us. We also asked the International Education Association of South Africa, IEASA, to share with us their vision for South African higher education. We thank the IEASA's president, Jack Wiseman, for his support, and we'll hear from two board members, Ms. Orla Quinlan and Dr. Tasmira Singh. For now, a quick comment on some of the items for today. We record the session as always. It will be publicly available on our YouTube channel. There is an evaluation at the end of the session, and we will post some useful links into the chat. We will share the PowerPoints with you after the session. Please post comments and questions into the chat as we go along, and we can raise these with our speakers. I can hear that some people, when they come in, they're not muted. Please mute yourself so we don't have to do it manually from this side. It's easier for our speakers if you don't interrupt. So now to our first speaker. Hans de Wit is a distinguished fellow, emeritus professor and past director of the Center for International Higher Education at the Boston College in the USA. He's a senior fellow of the International Association of Universities, and last year he received the Noam Chomsky North Star Lifetime Achievement Award of the Society of Transnational Academic Scholars. And we most heartily congratulate you, Hans, on this achievement. He's a founding member and past president of the European Association for International Education, founding editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education, and consulting editor to the Policy Reviews and Higher Education Journal. He writes and consults, amongst others, for the European Commission and the European Parliament, UNESCO, the World Bank, and the IAU. He's the foremost voice on internationalization on higher education and what this means for higher education. And we're most privileged to have you, Hans, share your thoughts with us today here at the USAF Helm Engage. So thank you, Professor Hans de Wit, over to you.
Thank you, Birgit, and thank you to the Higher Education Leadership and Management Helm for inviting me to this Engage session on internationalization of higher education. It's always a great pleasure and privilege to have this interaction with my South African colleagues, working with them for many years through IEASA and other entities, and being also part in the very consulting phase of the internationalization strategy for South Africa. So again, a great pleasure, and I'm going to share my screen with you. As Birgit has said, internationalization in the current situation is really in a very intense stage.
Hans, can I just interrupt you for a second? Your screen is showing all the slides on the side. If you go to display mode, it might make it easier for you.
This way?
Is it perfect? That's great.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. So we are countering a situation since basically 2020 where internationalization was having its own rhythm, etc., but now is so much interrupted, and I will address those issues during my talk. On the one hand, we see that we need to enhance what we have been doing, but also we have to encounter new challenges, but also new opportunities in how to make internationalization more inclusive and more sustainable, and but also how we do that in a way of global engagement around the world in a different way than was before. And in that, we have always to address why are we doing this and what are we doing, how are we doing it, but the most importantly is what is the impact of what we're doing with internationalization. Trying to see how internationalization has, according to many authors, always been part of higher education because universities had to work together and had to exchange, and students were mobile and faculty were mobile and higher education systems were mobile in a very colonialized way in particular and in an imperialist way. But the reality is also that most institutions of higher education have been created with a very much more local and national focus to create a national capacity in their countries and not with a very international dimension. It's only around the 1990s, as a result of the increasing globalization of our societies and economies, as the fall of the Iron Curtain, and by that the end of the first, I have now to say first, Cold War, that internationalization became mainstream as a strategic concept in higher education, first in the developed, so-called developed world, and then also much more globalized to the global south. Institutional, local, and regional contexts still are defining, in essence, what we are doing and why we are doing things. So context is very essential for a good understanding of internationalization of higher education. It's also important that when we address the why, there is a whole range of different rationales why we are doing this. Political motivations, increasingly more important in the current context of geopolitical tensions, economic drives which have been at the front of the past 30 years, socio-cultural motivations, and academic rationales have been there. And different stakeholders can have different rationales in doing that. But we have to understand very clearly why are we doing it and what is the context in which we are doing it. And those contexts and rationales change over time. Internationalization was something completely different in the 1980s when I started to work on internationalization of higher education. It was completely different in the 1990s and has been constantly changing also over the past decades. And we are encountering completely new substantial change, probably not for the better, I'm afraid, but with some opportunities for the next decades to come. And it requires intentional actions of all stakeholders to drive the agenda in a better way than in what we are facing at the current challenges, and I'll come back to that. We also have to acknowledge that internationalization in most cases is still very fragmented, ad hoc, and marginal. It is, although we know that more than 75% of the institutions of higher education and also increasingly more governments have internationalization as a strategic part of the overall mission, the reality is that in fact it is still very ad hoc and marginal in most cases. So let's face that also as a big challenge. And I'm seeing how I can move my screen, sorry. What we also have to keep in mind is that internationalization cannot be a goal in itself. We cannot internationalize because everybody else does it, or we can think it's nice to do that, but it has always to have a purpose. And we sometimes have forgotten about that purpose, in particular on the purpose of the third mission of higher education. We are wanting to internationalize education, we want to internationalize research, but we also have to look at our social mission, the third mission of higher education, and service to society. And that, as I will address as well, is becoming probably the most important driver that we need to internationalize higher education. And because internationalization is not a goal in itself, we have to place it in the context of what is happening with higher education in the global context. And two important parts are very important to understand. On the one hand, there is this massification of higher education, and we will address it also in the changing global political context, which is a very important other factor to have. But also there's the global knowledge economy, and related to that is the whole issue of rankings, excellence programs, and reputation. Massification refers to the fact that there is more demand for higher education still in the world, in particular in the global south, than there is offer of higher education. And as a result of that demand for higher education in the global south, we still have seen over the past decades an increase in number of students that are going to study abroad. In 1965, there were 250,000 students who studied in another country. Currently, we have over 5 million of students that study in another country, probably 5.5 million at the start of the pandemic. So an enormous increase of students that moved because there was not sufficient higher education, there was not adequate quality higher education in the whole country, so they had to move somewhere else. And that has created all kinds of challenges and problems, in particular in the global south, of brain drain, and although there has been all kinds of nice words to say, well, we're not talking about brain drain, it's brain circulation or it's brain gain. The reality is that if you look at data, in the OECD countries, more than 25% of the international students don't return to their home country, but stay in the countries where they have been. And probably in several countries, and we know data from Scandinavia and the Netherlands, it's more than 50%. In the United States, we know that over 70% of the doctoral students, international doctoral students, stay in the United States. So there is a brain drain. Let's be realistic about that, and let's see what that means for higher education. But massification has a negative impact, which we have to take into account. At the same time, the global knowledge economy has created much more inequality between those students and those talents that have access to high quality education, and between institutions of higher education and between countries. Since higher education and research have become so important as a driver for the knowledge economy in our societies, there has been increasing differentiation in higher education between the top world-class universities that are in the top 500 of the international rankings and the rest of the higher education institutions around the world. And that divide has been increasing. We all know that some Asian, and particularly Chinese universities, have been able to rise up in the rankings, but the reality is still it's a very Western-dominated phenomenon, and that will continue to be the case, and it will also be that by that, only very few people will have access to that kind of higher education. Funding will be directed mostly to those world-class universities, and access to top publications will be like that. So there is, on the one hand, an impact of massification, on the other hand, an impact of the global knowledge economy. And I'm not will be addressed much about rankings, but rankings are an unfortunate expression of that challenge that we are facing. because international students and international scholars and access to international publications are the main indicators for internationalization that those rankings use. And that has nothing to do with the overall quality of the higher education institutions in the world. And of course, what we face is the whole changing global political climate. We have seen already before 2020 an increased competition for global talents, and that is going on more and more. I just saw that, for instance, the European Commission now has this so-called talent partnership programs where they make agreements with countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, and later on with Nigeria and Senegal and Pakistan and Bangladesh, to have skilled immigration increased to the European Union to cover the shortage of talents and skilled labor in health sector and in IT and other important sectors for the knowledge economy. So that's an ongoing process and will be only accelerated because of the graying of our societies and the need for our knowledge economy in the developed world to continue to be dominant. And that also goes at the cost of countries in the global south. Another challenge, of course, is sustainability and the environment. We still see that international education contributes substantially negatively to climate, probably of the size of even bigger than one country like Tunisia, if you talk about mobility of students. But overall, by our work with our research, etc., higher education institutions contribute to the climate change, and we need to address it as well. Other sustainable development goals like poverty, etc., are important, but we also see challenges of increasing nationalism and populism in the United States during the Trump administration, in Hungary, in Poland. We see it in Russia, we see it in India, we see it in China, we see it in many countries, unfortunately, that there is an inward looking and not looking at international cooperation and exchange and global engagement in those countries. We see increasing racism, not only Black Lives Matter in the United States, but we see racism in Brazil, we see it in Russia, we see it unfortunately also in Ukraine, and we see it elsewhere as well. India is another example, China with respect to students from Africa. So that's also an important factor that we have to keep in mind. Of course, COVID-19 has had enormous impact on internationalization of higher education. That's certainly, on the one hand, all kind of mobility of students and talents stopped. So that it had an impact negatively on both the exchange programs like Erasmus, but also Fulbright, etc., and it had a negative impact on student mobility for full degree programs. On the other hand, it had stimulated maybe more the importance of research collaboration, because there was a requirement to develop vaccines, and vaccines were only possible to develop in joint research collaboration. But even in that context of vaccine development and vaccine distribution, we have seen a negative impact on equality, because many of countries in the global south have not been benefiting from those vaccines as we have been in the global north. And last but not least, we see all kinds of geopolitical developments and tensions. And of course, currently it is the Ukraine, which is the Russian invasion, the Russian war in Ukraine is a very clear example of that. But we also have seen before already all kinds of tensions between China and Australia, China and North America, and China and Europe. And all that impacts negatively on the way we engage with our academic institutions and academics as individuals and students around the world. I've been writing with my colleague Philip Albach on the case of, for instance, what are the implications for global engagement on Russia and Ukraine? It's very clear that Ukraine higher education is completely endangered by the Russian invasion and the killing of many academics and students, as many other people, but also the destruction of higher education institutions, and also the brain drain of refugees that had to leave the country. So that has an enormous negative impact on that country, and we need to do all possible to help them to recover. But at the same time, it also has an enormous negative impact on Russia, because we were, over the past 30 years, working very closely with institutions of higher education and academics and students in Russia from all over the world. And there was hope that that engagement and collaboration would help to make that country much more open and much more democratic in their views. And that has, from one day to the other, at the moment of the invasion in Ukraine, has come to a halt. And of course, there was no other way that governments and institutions of higher education needed to stop their formal partnerships with institutions of higher education in Russia. In particular, after all the rectors of the most important universities in Russia signed an agreement that they supported Putin in his invasion in Ukraine. There was no way we could accept that in the sense of a formal sense. But at the same time, we should try to avoid to completely break our relationships with our colleagues in Russia, because there are many academics who are not supporting Putin. There are many academics who even have flew away from Russia after the invasion because they didn't want to work in that context anymore, and they need our support. But there are also many who are not able to do that, students and faculty, who are even taken prison because of their criticism of the government. So we have to keep the lines open with those who are, hopefully, when Putin is away, can rebuild the country in an open society. That's very important as well. So we should not break all relations. I always, in my publication about the topic, make reference to the academic boycott during the South African apartheid regime. And I think that's also where you have many experiences with that. That was the only really boycott like we face now with Russia, which was massively boycotting all aspects of economy and society. And so it included an academic boycott to South Africa, no relationships with South African institutions. But even in those cases, we kept our contacts with individuals, academics and students open who were anti-apartheid and needed our collaboration, and have been useful that for the future building after the apartheid fall. So there is this necessity that we should not say all Russians are evil. We have to collaborate. And the same applies basically to China. Although it's becoming increasingly more difficult to collaborate on an institutional level with institutions of higher education in China, because there's no academic freedom, we still have to keep those channels open, otherwise we are in difficulty. So we have to ask ourselves the questions, how will internationalization deal with these momentous events of 2020-2022? How will we respond to all those challenges? And how will we try to reshape the future of internationalization of higher education and higher education in general to make our world better? That are very important questions to address. In that, we also have to be aware, and that was something that already was in discussion before 2020, that internationalization is perceived by many in the Global South as a Western paradigm. A development of internationalization dominated by the views from the largely Anglo-Saxon and predominantly English-speaking world, North America, Australia, and Europe. That's a fact. We cannot ignore the fact that that has been driving very much the agenda of internationalization in many years. We see, luckily enough, that there is a lot of movement and action going on in the global south. If I work a lot in Latin America and I see how many institutions of higher education are developing their own strategies for internationalization. I see similar developments in Africa. I see that also in Asia. But also I see still a tendency to copy what we are doing in the global north. If the global north we have to recruit international students, we have to have more international faculty, we have to publish in top international English-speaking journals, then in Africa and Latin America, they do the same. Where I think it's very important that you define your own internationalization strategy, your own terms, your own values, your own priorities, your own objectives, and demand that international cooperation will be much more on equal terms and will be increasingly much more south-south than only looking at the north. So that's another very important factor to keep in mind. Because if we look back at the situation before 2020 and still to a large extent the current situation, because I see also that many institutions and governments in the global north are starting to go back to the old norm, although that's not possible in my view. The past was that education abroad, all the mobility aspects are more driving still the agenda than internationalization at home. And I come back a little bit to that, to those two terms, but you probably are quite familiar with that. So mobility is still driving too much the agenda of internationalization. There was an increasing focus on international rankings, and that rules, that makes that others are more, a small group of institutions of higher education are much more important than the very large part of the world. We have in the international rankings something like 1,000, 1,500 institutions of higher education, and there are over 30,000 institutions of higher education in the world. The fight between the North and the South and between those university classes, top world-class universities and the others, continued to persist over the years. Internationalization has become synonym to competition and marketization and has moved away from its traditional values of cooperation, exchange, and service to society. As a result of all this, inequality and exclusiveness in the national international case is becoming much more important. So internationalization has become a very much more elitist kind of factor. Recognition of the importance of addressing all aspects of education in an integrated or comprehensive way in university policy and strategy process is only slow and unevenly increasing. The data of the International Association of Universities in the global survey, the last global survey 2 years ago, has shown that there is an increasing divide between a small group of institutions of higher education that really are internationalizing and others are not able to do that or not willing to do that. So there's still a long way to go in many aspects, but the essence is that inequality has been high, elitism has been high, and commercialization and marketization has also been very high in internationalization of higher education over the past decades. So there is a need for change. Because our concerns, which already were expressed before 2020, that internationalization is elitist, competitive, and market-oriented, still persist very much in the perception of governments and institutions of higher education. But there is an urgent need for more attention to the qualitative human dimensions of internationalization, including global citizen development, employability, improvement of the quality of research, education, service to society. And we have to move away from a much more output to outcome and impact approach to internationalization of higher education. That is what we need for the future. And in that, we have to look at the two components that are together, using Jay Knight's approach, internationalization, or what I would call, and I come back to that, global learning for all. And there is the internationalization abroad component, and there is the internationalization at home component. And internationalization abroad is also very diverse. We have students, as I mentioned, something like 5 million who are studying for a degree abroad. You have students who study abroad for a short period of time to get credits to going back to the home institution. Erasmus is a very clear example of that. The study abroad programs in the United States are part of that. Exchange agreements with scholarship agreements with governments are also part of that, but it's still relatively a small percentage around the world that has credit mobility. Then we have students who do short-term mobility or certificate mobility, as I call it. That are students who do language courses, summer courses, intensive courses, etc., for a few weeks, which is also a substantial number of students. There's, of course, staff mobility, academics who are mobile, either for short-term or full-time. There's administrative mobility, and then there is the program mobility, the branch campuses, the franchise operations, the articulation programs, which are also part of that whole motion. And internationalization abroad is still basically what many governments and also leaders of institutions of higher education perceive as being that is internationalization. And if we keep doing that, then we are making a big mistake because we only reach a very small percentage of our student and academic population. Worldwide, probably 1 to 2%. In Europe, thanks to Erasmus, etc., it might be 20%. In the United States, it might be 10%. But we know from data that overall in the world, it is 1 to 2%. And probably in Africa, it's even far less than 1%. And if we do that, then we exclude 98 or 99% of the academic community from the need to internationalize. But that's why it is so important to have internationalization at home. Creating a campus environment of internationalization where all aspects of the university demonstrate the international intercultural dimensions of its policies. Of course, and I come back to that internationalization of the curriculum, how we can make that much more internationalized, how we teach and learn in an international context, and how we can develop intercultural, international competencies and learning outcomes. That aspect, internationalization at home, is still underestimated, is still mainly active in policies and in words, but not in actions, and needs much more attention if we really want to make a difference. But internationalization at home by my colleagues, Jos Been and Elspeth Jones, has been defined as the purposeful integration of international intercultural dimensions into the formal and informal curriculum for all students within domestic learning environments. So it means that we have to look not only at the students who go abroad, but we have to look at all students, and we have to look at the formal curriculum, that is what the study programs are, and the informal curriculum, that's what the students learn outside of the classroom of international intercultural competencies. And then related to that, and I think there's not so much difference in my perception between internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum, there is the definition by Betty Lisk from Australia of internationalization curriculum is the process of incorporating international, intercultural and global dimensions to the content of the curriculum, as well as the learning outcomes, assessment tasks, teaching methods, and support services of a program. So internationalization of the curriculum is not only to look at the content. Of course, it's very important that the content of the curriculum is not defined by the hidden curriculum, the perceptions of the academics who have in general either a foreign or a local experience, but not a combination of the two. It is not defined by the textbooks who are mostly from the global north, but it has to have, the content has to have different local and geographical perspectives, different cultural perspectives. So that's one thing. But you have also defined what international intercultural learning outcomes do students need to have when they are in a course or when they are finishing programs. How do you evaluate, how do you assess those international intercultural learning outcomes? What teaching methods will you use to make that, to teach international interculturally? So can you use the international students in your classroom? Can you use visiting professors in your classroom? Can you use collaborative online learning or virtual exchange in your classroom to really bring in those kind of perspectives? And what kind of support service do you have of a program of study to make that international, intercultural and global dimension much more important? So internationalization curriculum, in my sense, is the core of what we need to do to break the pattern of only focusing on the mobility. Mobility can be part of internationalization of the curriculum. And the mobility in itself is not bad. I have benefited myself from studying abroad, so that I would not be saying that it was a negative part, but we have to be conscious of the fact that only a very small percentage of the student population benefits from that possibility, because they're not able to for financial reasons, they're not able to for family reasons, they're not able to for whatever. There are only very strong limitations. And even in Europe, with this massive support by the European Commission, has not been able to reach more than 20%. And that's much more easier than having to do that in a context like Africa. So we have to make this much more at the core of what we are doing. We also have to realize that it is very important not only to prepare our students to become good professionals in the international cultural context, but also that they are responsible citizens. And so we need to create a responsible learning program that prepares students to address the sustainable development goals in the world. And that's what we call in our study with Betty Lisk, Elspeth Jones, Ur Brandenburg, and I for the DAD, Internationalization of Higher Education for Society. So bringing in the third mission, not only focusing on how we can internationalize our education so that students are good professionals, not only focusing on internationalization of research so that we have all kind of patents, etc., but that we really are focusing our research and our education on helping society to cover the main problems that we have and increasingly are going to have in our society, in our economies around the world. So constantly we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this before we can say what are we doing and how are we doing it? And we also always have to look at what is the impact, what are the outcomes of our strategy? And that is quite different by type of institution. There's not one answer to that model. We have always to ask ourselves in our context what we are going to do. I work in Boston College in the United States, and 3 miles from my institution there is Harvard and there's MIT. And although we're all 3 in Boston, in the Boston area, metropolitan area, we have completely different contexts. Harvard and MIT are top world-class institutions of higher education, but a very strong focus on postgraduate research and education. They are leaders in the world, and their internationalization strategy is not so explicit because they assume they are the greatest and the best of the world, so everybody comes to them and they need another strategy to make that happen. Where Boston College is a national research institution, but also a Jesuit Catholic institution. And so they have a different strategy. They have to link their internationalization strategy to their social mission as being a Jesuit institution. They have to look much more at how can we work with other similar kind of institutions around the world to really to create social justice, etc. So that's a different context, and we have to keep that in mind. So why are we doing this is very important before we can define what kind of objectives, what kind of priorities are we going to say? How are we going to organize that? And we always have to keep in mind, try to think about what is the impact of what we're doing. That is what is needed. And already in 1965, my colleague John Davis called that an internationalization strategy evolution matrix. How can we move from this ad hoc and marginal to a much more comprehensive internationalization strategy? Many institutions are still in the A of the matrix, being very marginal and ad hoc in their activities. There are some professors who do something. If they go away, then the things will finish because there's not a strategic strategy. There's some who are in B, where some schools or departments are very systematic, but it doesn't really impact the whole of the institution. There are others who are in C, who have a central international office that has memorandums of understanding around the world, that exchange some students, that exchange some faculty, but it's completely isolated from the rest of the institution strategy. And a really comprehensive strategy has to be central and systemic in all of the activities of the institution. And I can assure you, I have been all over the world in many institutions of higher education. There are very few who are really moving in the direction of being central and systematic. And if I ask institutions or people in the institutions, where are you? Many of them even think that they are already central and systematic, but if you then look at really what they are doing, it is probably much more in B or C, and many other institutions are still in A. So you need to have, as John Hudzik has defined in 2011 already, a comprehensive internationalization strategy. A commitment and action to infuse everything which is international, global, and comparative in all what you are doing in education, research, and service to society. What is all active in all your aspects, both in the institution and also in your partnerships and relationships outside of the institution. Internationalization, in my view, is too much still an international office policy. And I have nothing against international offices. I've been working in international offices at the start of my career for several years, and they do extremely important and good work. But if it stays there and it is not embedded in human resource development, academic affairs, student affairs, departments, schools, finance, etc., then it's not really a comprehensive strategy and it stays ad hoc and marginal. So we really have to start thinking about how we can make it comprehensive. And first Jay Knight and later I refined that. We developed an Internationalization Circle as describing the process how to do that. First, analyze the context. Why are we having to do this in our internal, external context as an institution of higher education? Building that awareness among all the stakeholders, students, staff, faculty, and society, about that they are aware about the importance of the why question. Create commitment, not only commitment by the director of the international office and the director of the university, by all stakeholders that really we want to internationalize and for this reason. And only then you're going to do, what are we going to do? What are our needs? What are our objectives? What our priorities are? And then you can think about how are you going to do it, and you operationalize it by creating offices, funding, etc., etc. And only then you're going to implement your strategy, but you constantly have to review it and you constantly have to reinforce it because, as I said, context change both internally and externally. And the most important is you always have to look in all the 8 steps. What is the integration effect that it has on teaching, research, and service function of higher education? Because otherwise, internationalization stays a goal in itself and doesn't impact what we are doing as the institution as a whole. So our most important challenges for the future are internationalization at home, curriculum, competencies, learning outcomes for all students, encounters more recognition in words, but lacks action and strategic approach for higher education institutions. North-South partnerships are still strongly unequal. Internationalization is still mostly marginal, fragmented, and ad hoc, and not integrated in the overall mission of higher education. And still mainly institutionally driven, isolated from a local, national, regional, and global context. We have to have much more working together to make things change. And in 2015, we looked at the definition of internationalization of higher education, which was quite common until then, the one by J. Knight, about the internationalization is the process of integrating an international, intercultural, and global dimension into the purpose, delivery, and presentation of higher education institutions. And we said that's in itself a nice working definition. It basically describes what we are doing. But everybody can interpret the why are we doing and what we want to have as an outcome when we use that working definition. And the reality is that we know that most of the internationalization of higher education has become very exclusive and very elitist. So it has to become much more inclusive and less elitist. We know that still mobility is driving mainly the agenda, but mobility can only be useful as when it is an integrated part of the internationalization of the curriculum that ensures internationalization for all. We know that internationalization should not be a goal in itself, but a means to enhance quality of what we are doing. But we need to make that much more clear, and it should also not be focused by solely the economic rationales, which has been since 1990s mainly the driving rationale for internationalization of higher education. So we updated that definition. And you can criticize it in the sense that it is normative. It's much more normative than the original definition of J. Knight, which was, as I said, a working definition. But we said, if we don't give it a clear direction, what we think is important, then we're not going to accomplish the needs of our society. So it is a process that cannot be going by itself. It has to be an intentional process. It is in order to enhance the quality of education and research. It has to be for all students and staff and not for a small elite. And it has to make a meaningful contribution to society. That definition of 2015, luckily enough, has been taking more support around the world, but is even more urgent in the current situation after 2020 than it was before that. We really have to make a meaningful contribution to society, and we have to make internationalization much more sustainable and inclusive, because it's so important that we do that. Because mobility programs, again, are out of the reach of the majority of students attending colleges and universities. And the reality is that all our students will live and work not only as professionals, but also as citizens in this increasingly connected and divided world. Even students that are going to work after their graduation from a local institution in South Africa, around the corner, in a company, or in a hospital, or in a bank, or whatever, they know that they have to be understanding what the international intercultural competencies of that work are. Otherwise, you cannot work in these days. Otherwise, you don't understand what COVID means. Otherwise, you don't understand what all kind of local diseases mean for international patients you have, etc., etc. So we have, as universities, a responsibility to contribute to the creation of a dynamic and sustainable global communities. Not so much the pursuit of personal material wealth, but caring for human values in general. And Betty Lisk and I called that aligning the practice of internationalization with human values and the common global good already in 2019. Thinking out of the box of traditional internationalization, mainly focused on mobility. Align international intercultural to other key values and themes. Racism, multiculturalism, climate, health, poverty, sustainable development goals, decolonization, all those many aspects. So what is needed for the future is moving away from the market-oriented approach to a traditional, much more cooperative approach, as we knew it before the 1990s. Moving away from English as the dominant language in higher education and towards a much more national institutional language policy, also very important in the South African context, with your different local languages, and also the challenges with Afrikaans on the one hand, but also the dominance of English on the other hand. Taking advantage of lessons learned in the pandemic, realizing global learning for all by making use for collaborative online international learning or virtual exchange, not by replacing in-person education by online learning, as several people already before the COVID-19 had predicted that brick and mortar university would disappear. One thing we have learned from the pandemic is that students, administrators, and academics want to have a living academic community. And that means in-person activities. But in that in-person activity, you can also make use of online expertise. You can connect with students and faculty abroad online. You don't have to go abroad to learn from other experiences. You can have capacity building online. You can have business meetings with administrators online. You can have all kinds of possibilities to replace the movement by people. And that's a great opportunity for, in particular, institutions of higher education in the Global South, because they are not depending on the income of international students as we are in the Global North. So you have a possibility to create a different type of internationalization, much more focused on the at-home side and global learning for all, without being dependent on the mobility side. Not again replacing mobility completely for those who want it and who have the capacity to do it, but mainly focusing on internationalization for all. Link internationalization to innovation, the needs of local regional development, also very important. Not thinking that you have to internationalize because of the interest of others. And link, as we said before, internationalization to the third mission, service to society, and making it global, local, and local global. In that, global engagement is more important than ever. Because inequality is more prominent than ever before, both between individuals, institutions, and countries. And unfortunately, cooperation is still primarily based on unequal footing. As my colleague Cornelis Hagemeyer in his PhD, which he graduated with at University of Cape Town, was addressing this issue. So how can we make much more equality in internationalization and cooperation, academic cooperation? Because partnerships are still based primarily on a combination of dominance and instruments, not on equality and not on the content of it. But as I said at the beginning, global engagement is more than ever needed. It has to be built on inclusion, engagement, and service to society. Otherwise, we will lose the battle with our planet, and we also are going to be isolated again in a second Cold War with, on the one hand, a small group of countries, Russia, China, and the allies, and the Western world on the other side, and a non-alignment world in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which tries to see how can we survive in this new Cold War environment. And that would be very detrimental for academic collaboration. So to end, 7 themes for the future were identified when we asked young rising scholars in internationalization of higher education from around the world. And they said inclusivity and equity are very key. That are the key 2 points. Related to that, a decolonialized internationalization, moving away from this Western paradigm. More focus on internationalization for society, more attention to what we call forced internationalization, attention to refugees and immigrants around the world, big challenge. More attention to internationalization of the curriculum at home, more focus on digital internationalization, and more attention to the affordability of internationalization, because many countries in the Global South have challenges how to deal with that. So these are some of the themes that we have to address in the future of higher education. And if we do that, we can really make a transformative internationalization by asking ourselves, who is engaged in the process and who is left out? What might equitable and inclusive internationalization look like? And what leadership is needed for that? Very important also in the context of Helm. How can internationalization be deployed as a tool of decolonization? How can internationalization better prepare all graduates in society to face future global challenges? And what deeper systematic changes need to be made? For example, the internationalization practices and policies, power structures, teaching methods, tuition policies, and other aspects of internationalization to address inequities in society? How can internationalization ever be strengthened in order to make a more meaningful contribution to society? What do reimagination, mobility, and blended mobility models look like? And how could we develop a holistic approach and the digital transformation included to that? These I think are also key questions for the future. And with that, I end my presentation and look forward to both question and answers and to the next presentation from my colleagues from IEASA. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hans. Thank you so much. I'm going to speed us right along. I just want one question that was bouncing around in the chats. There was a comment made about how hard it is to develop one's own definition, a local, indigenous, perhaps global South definition, when the indicators of success, like in the rankings and whatever, you know, having mobility and so forth, when those indicators are dominated by certain categories. So we need to take those indicators into the definition and yet somehow should create our own definition. How do you respond to that sort of tension? Yeah, well, I think you always have to do that. I mean, you always have to look from your context. Context is so crucial. There's not one model for all, and there's also not one defining definition for all, because you have to interpret that definition to your own context. And indigenous is an increasingly important part of that process. Because if you, in a debate I had with Damtu Tefera, my friend from Ethiopia, but for a long time in Durban, and now I think with the African Union of Universities, Association of Universities, he said, well, when you talk about an intentional process, internationalization is not possible in the African context. And I said, well, you have to do both. You have to create your own identity. So you have to create an Africanization. And if you do that, that is very important. That's looking at your indigenous context. But if you then not at the same time do international, then you are excluding yourself from the rest of the world. Mm. Where if you do the opposite, if you internationalize without defining your own indigenous identity, you are still dominated by the Western paradigm. So you have to try to combine those two things in your definition, in your context, and then develop your own strategy. And a definition like I presented, the working definition by Jane Knight, but in particular the updated one, has by that to be very general to make that possible. And that was my problem. And I must say I have had intensive discussions with Jane Knight about it, because she found our much too normative. But I still remember that I was once with her in Australia, and they used her definition and said, well, so internationalization is recruitment of international students for revenue, because that fitted in the definition. And that is exactly what we don't want. That's not what our normative approach has to be. No. And so I must say I'm very proud to see how many good scholars are starting to work in Africa, in Latin America, and in some parts of Asia that are challenging this Western paradigm and look into what does it mean in our indigenous context. That I think you have to define that. I cannot define that for you, because that would I'm just a white person from the global north. I only can say it's important to do that, because I see from my side that the dominance is continuing. Yeah. So you're quite right, and I think our next presentation might address some of the issues around the definition, because of course your definition, the 2015, was accepted by our DHET, and there were some comments in chat going around on that, and how we kind of accepted that and how we should engage with that definition that was just imported. Let me just go to the next speakers quickly, because our time is running. Our next speakers, we've got two speakers, is Orla Quinlan and Tasmira Singh. They're both from IEASA and are presenting to us for the next 24 minutes. We have a recording, so we are safe, because we were a bit worried about the networks. Orla Quinlan holds a master's in social policy, planning and implementation in developing countries from the London School of Economics and Political Science. From 1995, Orla worked in a range of social justice and change issues in South Africa, and her activities included serving as a board member and treasurer on the Gender Advocacy Program and serving as a senior researcher on the Gender Equity Task Team commissioned by the then Department of Education. Returning to Makhanda in 2011, Ola joined Rhodes University as the Director of Internationalization and is serving in the International Education Association of South Africa in a range of leadership positions. We also have Tasmira Singh. Dr. Singh is an international higher education specialist with over 22 years experience in the field. She's currently at CPUT as the manager of the International Relations Office there. Prior to her appointment at CPUT, she was at UKZN as the Principal International Advisor. Dr. Singh has previously served on the Management Council of IEASA and was also part of the Conference Committee for 2017 and 21 and head of the Research and Publications Committee. So I thank both of them for a lovely presentation that they recorded over the weekend and sent to us. And I'm going to ask our tech team to play it now. And then we have probably 5 minutes left for questions at the end. Rassi, can we play that?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Brigitte, for that introduction, and thank you to Helm and Yusuf for inviting IEASA to this platform today to engage with you all. It's an honor to be present, and may I also take the opportunity on behalf of IEASA to congratulate Hans de Wit, a long-standing friend of IEASA, on receiving the Noam Chomsky Lifetime Achievement Award. I just want to start by talking a little bit about the relationship between IEASA and Yusuf. Because it's significant in the history of internationalization in South Africa. Following a period of isolation from the rest of the academic world due to the anti-apartheid boycotts, the international community was keen to engage with South Africa, and students and academics wanted to come into South Africa, but the universities did not have the structures, knowledge, skills in place to deal with the unique issues facing incoming international students who wanted to register in the South African system. So as a result, it was the South African registrars and DVCs reacting to this new phenomena who decided to come together and set up IEASA to resolve these issues collectively. Because of the existence of IEASA, Yusuf did not duplicate by having a USEP professional group dealing with internationalization. So the national conversations on internationalization have been happening in a separate space, in a separate organization. And with turnover of personnel, I think it's important to just realize that that is a resource on which people can draw going forward. Our engagement with VCs and DVCs has been particularly disrupted in the last 2 years with the move to doing a lot of work online. But there is a need to start re-engaging and building relationships both within institutions and across institutions as we move back into a face-to-face engagement. There remains a close working relationship between IEASA and Yusuf. There's always a representative from Yusuf sitting on IEASA's council, and we engage frequently and regularly with Professor Ahmed Bawa, who's the chief executive of Yusuf, on many issues pertaining to internationalization in South Africa. We also collaborate on the only publication which provides an overview of South African higher education, which is Study SA. And so, yes, there is a continuing good working relationship, and we hope to build on that and continue to engage even further going forward. The next point I want to talk about is IEASA's engagement with the rest of the continent and our collaboration with other international networks. So IEASA was actually involved in the initiation of the African Network of Internationalization of Higher Education. We currently have an active partnership, and most recently we held a joint conference in 2020. Among others, Professor Chika Siholi from the University of Pretoria is a well-known South African academic who plays a very active role in engaging with ANI and has sat on the board for many years. Other academics who really are very well known across the continent for engaging across these networks would be Professor Damtu Tefera, who is the founding director of the International Network of Higher Education in Africa and is based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Most of our South African public institutions belong to SARUA, which is a Southern African regional network, and also SANORD, which is a network which is a collaboration between Southern African universities, Southern African, not just South Africa, and the Nordic countries. And this network really tries to model an equitable North-South collaborative engagement of mutual respect. Now, many of the contact persons in each university for each of these networks also sit on the IEASA Directors Forum. And IEASA leaders in general engage widely with other organizations from the Global South, such as FAUBAI, our Brazilian sister organization. And also, IEASA was one of the founding members of the Global Network of International Education Associations. And we have an ongoing and active engagement with that global network on the issues that affect internationalization globally, because there are trends, which I'm sure Hans has referred to, that, you know, we can see across the globe at the moment in terms of the current context we're all operating within. When it comes to funding for intra-Africa projects, most of that still comes from European and North American sources, including government funding and private foundations. ARUA is an example of a very specific network of research-intensive universities across Africa who decided to fund themselves and to date remain independently funded. Several individual universities have their own relationships and research collaborations with other universities across the continent. But this is not a platform here today to go into specific projects and programs and examples, but just to create an awareness that they do exist, and there are resources within most universities that you can be connected to via IEASA. If there are people who are doing things and you want to start, we can help you connect with people who can help you in that regard. I'd now like to move on to what we consider this massive progress, having been the conversation holders of internationalization. We really were delighted when we finally got a national policy framework on international of higher education in South Africa. So IEASA played a significant role in the development of this policy. We held workshops on around our annual conferences on this topic. We were very involved in consultations over several years. And the policy framework document itself recognizes IEASA as the non-statutory body leading on internationalization in South Africa. For today, let me just emphasize that the policy provides a backdrop for the rationale for internationalization of higher education in our specific context and in relation to our neighbors on the continent. The guidance is provided within the policy framework to each institution to work towards infusing comprehensive internationalization into the three pillars of our universities: research, teaching and learning, community and engagement. The policy framework is a framework, and as such, it is not prescriptive and implicitly recognizes that the policy, strategy and plan for internationalization in any university must be context specific. And you can see across South Africa, certain disparities in resourcing allow some people to really develop and build on this area of work and resource it well, whereas others have less resources. But there are ways of doing internationalization on campus that, you know, can accommodate this diversity. So it is now mandatory for each institution to develop its own policy, strategy and plan with annual reporting targets for DHET. So if we just move on to the next slide, I just want to show you, this is more or less you will get guidance and parameters on all of these issues. I think from point 4 to point 8 is really practical guidance around if you are dealing with cross-border mobility, cross-border programming, and then also the issues about internationalization at home and quality assurance. So there is some guidance on what is definitely allowable, what is not encouraged, but there is a lot of openness within the whole policy for you to develop policy and plans there. We've also developed a summary guide, which has been prepared for you, which can be shared if you don't have the time to really go in depth to the whole policy framework. Okay, so moving on, it is quite ironic that we were so excited that we finally now had the policy framework in the domain, and we were getting ready for new conversations across South African universities. And then, of course, we got hit by the disruption of COVID. And that had a particularly dramatic effect on internationalization. I mean, worldwide travel more or less halted for a significant period of time. So all that traditional mobility stopped. But quite a lot of new innovation occurred during that time. And my colleague Tasmira will go into that in more depth. But I just want to talk a bit more about the impact of our challenging context on internationalization. As we're speaking to a South African audience here today, we don't need to dwell too long on the specifics of the disruptions that higher education has faced in the last few years, including the impact of fees must fall, the shift to emergency online teaching and learning when maybe some universities weren't particularly geared up to do that, the deteriorating environmental context in which we're working, evidenced by the recent destructive floods in KwaZulu-Natal and the devastating droughts in Eastern Cape, as well as the difficult and disappointing and challenging political context in which we are now operating. All of this is taking its toll on higher education. And the higher education landscape is stressed and the people in it are very stretched. So while the challenges may be ongoing, we need to first of all recognize what has the impact been on internationalization. So one of the aspects I want to draw attention to is the severe drop of international students coming to South Africa. And this didn't just happen during the COVID period. It actually has been a trend since, really since post-fees must fall. So most of our students who come to South Africa are from the SADC region and the rest of the continent. And it's a concern that this decrease has occurred. It has been raised by IEASA with Devitt. And we're also dealing with a damaged reputation to the ostensible xenophobic attacks and unrest, and which are we have outbursts every so often over the last few years. But of the international students who still want to come into South Africa, there has been a serious impact in the capacity of government departments to assist them in coming into South Africa. So for example, students due to register in 2022 have not, due to delays in the issuing of police clearance certificates, the processing of student visas, they've not been able to register in a timely fashion, leading to the loss of some of their sponsored funding to come into South Africa. Now, IEASA is calling a meeting with the various government entities in an attempt to resolve this before the next year's academic registration period. But these types of bureaucratic obstacles also affect working with partners across the continent. So there are delays, for example, in SACWA verification of qualifications for students coming in to do, periods of study as part of programs. There is issues around accreditation, recognition, and equivalence. They also experience visa processing delays. And then there are issues around the quality assurance processes for innovative cross-border programming. There is a lot of work to be done, and it does need to be done collectively. These are not issues that one university can resolve by itself. So we need a collaborative approach, and we need to engage with the various relevant bodies and government departments. And IEASA is planning on hosting that conversation, and will be addressing some of these issues in its annual conference to be held in August of this year. So while there are all these enormous challenges, there is also a huge amount of creativity has evolved over this period. And I would like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Tasmira Singh, to now take forward some of the opportunities and some ideas about how do we reimagine internationalization in South Africa and our engagement with the continent within this context. Thank you, Tasmira.
Thank you, Ola, for providing a historical lens to the initiation of IEASA and situating IEASA very centrally within the higher education internationalization landscape. Indeed, the need for the adoption of the 2020 National Policy Framework for Internationalization of Higher Education was first identified by IEASA in the early 2000s, but it was not until 2012 that any real progress was made towards the drafting of this policy. As Ola mentioned earlier, the national policy offers universities an opportunity to create a policy or strategy that is situational to the context of South African higher education in a post-pandemic frame against, that is situational to institutions, context, and culture. So how then do we reimagine internationalization within the context of South African higher education in a post-pandemic frame against the backdrop of the national policy, the issues of transformation plaguing the sector, and the imperatives of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 4 and 17 for this presentation? To begin with, what are the critical aspects enshrined in the policy that makes way for us to reimagine internationalization in a post-pandemic frame? Let us examine the national policy articulation of as follows, which is to position the higher education system to be competitive in a globalized world, to advance the quality of higher education, to enhance intellectual diversity nationally and regionally in teaching and learning, research and community aspects, engagement aspects of higher education, to benefit society and enhance opportunities for higher education to contribute to the public good. Further, to contribute towards the development of scholars and scholarship capable of addressing global challenges. This is as per the policy. Thus, it is evident that the national policy speaks to the larger goals of internationalization and its place in the globalized world, as well as its role towards the creation, contribution of a better society. How then should universities in South Africa interpret this in articulating their own policies in a meaningful way, bearing in mind the perplexing issues of diversity, inclusion, and equality for all? Some suggestions and a way forward would be to take into consideration the ability to creatively expand on internationalization at home activities, to extend opportunities to the majority of students who do not reap the benefits of international exposure due to their own socioeconomic, cultural, and material circumstances. Internationalization of the curriculum that speaks to the realities of our context while simultaneously remaining globally relevant in deploying divergent pedagogical approaches. The need to focus on joint international collaborative programs and joint degrees on the continent and beyond as an imperative to diversify and create multicultural learning environments to produce globally relevant scholars who are able to confront universal challenges. Further, we need to create strategic partnerships that are multidisciplinary in nature, focusing on the exchange of research with transformational benefits to larger society. So what can universities actually do in addressing the broad goals of internationalization in confronting the realities of their institutional context, bearing in mind the fiscal constraints, the upending political climates, and the imperative need to work closely with partner institutions in Africa? As higher education international specialists, we are aware that the policy framework strongly encourages partnering with the continent and expanding our African footprint. But as universities, have we successfully done this as an integral aspect of internationalization? I think realistically speaking, within our context, our engagement with the global South has been asymmetrical compared to the relations of the global North. In the past, traditional paradigms of internationalization by way of student exchange programs was celebrated as the gold standard of internationalization. However, with the acute disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic halting internationalization globally, higher education institutions had to rethink their international activities creatively and with relevance for the broader and more significant goals of internationalization. But what elements should a post-pandemic internationalization policy or strategy embrace? And for today's discussion, I want to focus on two aspects, which is partnerships and COIL projects as a process by which we can collaborate more closely with institutions in Africa. So to begin with, very practically, institutions in thinking through their internationalization policy can attempt to use a very targeted approach to establishing partnerships with SADC, Africa, the Global South, Global North, Asia Pacific, BRICS, ACU, embassies and consulates, funding agencies such as STINT, DAAD, NAFIC, and the British Council, amongst others, as well as look at networks such as ANI, IEASA, SANOD, AIEA, EAIE, NAFSA, and API, etc. The basic principles of a partnership when you thinking through your internationalization policy is it must be one of mutuality, trust, equality, reciprocity, honesty, sustainable and financially viable. It must be trans and multi as well as interdisciplinary approach whereby the academic curriculum lends itself to joint degrees and collaborative online COIL short courses. In other words, we're advocating for transformational partnerships. So in terms of COIL, it is an innovative approach to teaching and learning, which provides academics and students with the ability to communicate and collaborate with peers internationally through online platforms. COIL also fosters meaningful exchanges between academics and students in geographically distant locations and from different linguocultural backgrounds. Some institutions in the country are far ahead in terms of COIL projects and COIL strategies, whilst to some it is still a nascent concept. Certainly in my own institution, we do not have any recent COIL partnerships in Africa, but it is a developing conversation as the relevance to establish African partnerships in Africa is more pertinent than ever before. COIL also bears relevance for the internationalization at home component of comprehensive internationalization and allows for the creation of global classrooms across multicultural contexts. COIL participation is an inexpensive means by which we can internationalize on so many levels, also fostering a global mindset as students and academics from diverse socio-cultural and geopolitical backgrounds connect. If anything, COVID-19 accelerated 4IR as universities locally and globally had to move to an online teaching and learning mode. Of course, this was not without challenges. Another recommendation as institutions think through their internationalization policies is the ways in which capacity development projects, such as the Intra-Africa project, which is a highly competitive application, can be entered into to increase the scope and depth of mobility as a means of engaging with institutions in Africa. However, there are definite challenges with partnering with universities in Africa, which Ola briefly alluded to. And this would require our national stakeholders such as DHET, DHA, amongst others, to come together in order for our institutional policies to address as elucidated in the national policy framework. IEASA plans on catalyzing this and has already engaged with DHET and DHA on this matter. In conclusion, international offices and IEASA have developed a strong collective knowledge of the opportunities and obstacles affecting internationalization in South Africa, and in particular, our engagement with the rest of the continent. We would encourage institutions to collaborate on internationalization and to share our collective experience and knowledge to assist the whole of South Africa, of the South African system, to stay engaged with the rest of the region and the continent and the world. I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ola and Tasmira. That was great, very comprehensive, and it's very useful to hear how it's kind of emerged and how it grew. I'm aware of time, and I want to just pick up on one issue, Tamira, that you've now mentioned. You said that COVID mainly kind of put a halt on internationalization, when in fact, I suspect you mean it put a halt on the mobility part of internationalization. Can you comment a little bit, and I'll ask Hans as well, I'll comment on that, on how COVID has in fact accelerated internationalization in innovative and new ways?
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Wonderful. Absolutely. So what COVID did was actually halt physical mobility, exchange of students, study abroad programs. We know we were just, insulated. But what it did do was create opportunities for us to think creatively in terms of internationalization. And I know within my very own context, it created the momentum and impetus to engage more closely with COIL projects to develop joint degree policies. So what it did do was accelerate this very, and of course, in doing all of this, it enlarged, created opportunities for more people to engage in internationalization. So, we need to, and we are at a point where we know for a fact that physical mobility is just a very small part of internationalization, and we recognize that that is actually not internationalization. And in my institution, which I'm 4 months part of, we're certainly doing a lot of work in terms of the virtual space and creating this notion of comprehensive internationalization, where internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, these are most pertinent in terms of the way forward within the space. And certainly, when we talk about inclusion and equality, we've got to come with that lens in mind. So thank you.
Thanks, Tasmira, for that. Hans, can you say something about how COVID, in fact, has accelerated internationalization in new ways we didn't even imagine?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with what Tasmira said about this. I mean, every crisis has also an opportunity, and this was, of course, a very major crisis and forced us to think about what we need to do. I personally think that it has accelerated many things that we already were saying, but didn't get the chance to convince our leaderships to do that. So collaborative online international learning was already on the agenda, but had not as momentum. Now suddenly people saw it was possible and we can do that. Looking at much more how we can collaborate in South-South was possible because the North was closed out. So there was another opportunity, and the list is even much longer. I mentioned already research collaboration as an important factor to make the transformation innovation. So I think that in itself is a positive development, that it has been transformative and much more innovative. The risk is there that we fall back in old habits and we are not keeping the momentum going to make that change really profound. So that's what that needs intentions. And I think to a certain extent, as I mentioned in my talk, countries like South Africa have an opportunity much more not to fall in old habits, because you were, although you have quite some international students from the region, but you had already a stronger South-South focus anyway. So you're not dependent on international students as a revenue choice. That makes it much more possible for you to take the momentum to continue to do that. And I see that as a very positive development.
That's great. I'm going to unfortunately have to close us off in a second. Ola has sent through the link or has made a comment on being able to join conferences online, which makes it much more accessible. Of course, the conference from IEASA is up and we put that link into the chat. I want to close off and thank everyone. Hans, very much for your time. Tasmira and Ola for your time. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the Helm team in the background who's making this possible. Oliver Rassi, Patrick, Michelle, Molatello, and so forth. Thank you, everyone. You're welcome. Put your cameras on while we wave goodbye to each other. And I wish you all a happy end of the day. And I'll see you again probably on the 24th of May when our next Engage is focusing on the 4IR of higher education. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.